Hello and welcome to the History of Philosophy in China by Peter Adamson and Karen Lai, brought to you with the support of the Philosophy Department at King's College London and the LMU in Munich. Online at historyofphilosophy.net. Today's episode, The Trembling Ox, Mengzi and the Compassionate Heart. How would you feel if you happened to see a child about to fall into a well? Would you feel alarmed? Would you panic? Or would you just be curious to see what happens next? In what is probably the most famous passage of the great Confucian text called the Mengzi, we are presented with this scenario, which is meant to illustrate that all human beings feel alarm upon witnessing another person in danger. This thought experiment is used to support Mengzi's view that we have it in us to make a far better life together. The fact that we cannot bear to see another's suffering is the very foundation of moral life. As a resource in hand, or rather in our heart minds, Xin, our compassion for others must be cultivated in the right ways. Of utmost importance is the moral environment we live in. Being surrounded by models such as exemplary fathers and brothers who show us the proper ways to be respectful or deferential, living in a society that does not tolerate attempts to debase our humanity, and having a ruler who cares about the welfare of his people. In such an advantageous setting, we may develop our appreciation of what is morally significant. These basic elements of Mengzi's vision bear the hallmarks of Confucian belief in the fundamental importance of societal influence and having a ruler who leads by virtue. But we might already be thinking that Mengzi's assumptions are just too naive. Has he not come across acts of prejudice, inhumanity, oppression, coercion, or violence? As one of the three most significant Confucian thinkers of this unstable time, the other two being Kongzi and Shunzi, Mengzi should have had plenty of exposure to the distress, pain, and suffering humans cause to others. He speaks to officials and rulers about the weak and elderly who are left to die in ditches, and holds the rulers to account for such abominations. The Mengzi speaks regularly and pointedly about the failures of those in power to look after the people, in many cases resulting in widespread suffering. How did his own society get into such a sorry state if all of us instinctively recoil from the sight, even the prospect, of the suffering of others? In this episode, we will see how the Mengzi weaves together the elements of a distinctive view regarding the human capacity for goodness. As with Kongzi and the Analects, Mengzi did not write the work that bears his name. The conversations presented here, many of them with rulers of different states, were written by different authors. Here again, as with the Analects, we should not expect systematically constructed arguments. But in comparison to the Analects, the Mengzi contains more extended conversations, where it is possible to follow lines of argument. Some of its views might at first seem simple-mindedly optimistic, more wish list than penetrating analysis. However, when we look deeper into Mengzi's philosophy, we can find subtle and persuasive ideas that prompt us to think more carefully about the centrality of morality to human life. We will take a close look at two of the Mengzi's conversations in this episode to get a feel for some of the most compelling aspects of Mengzi's views on human goodness. We've already mentioned the first conversation concerning that much-cited example of a child about to fall into a well, and we'll return to it later. In our second story, Mengzi has an extended conversation with King Xuan of the state of Qi. A true virtuous king protects the people, says Mengzi, proceeding to assure Xuan that he does have the capability to become a true king. In the ongoing conversation, Mengzi takes two seemingly opposing lines. He affirms his confidence in the king, yet at the same time criticizes the king with fairly sharp words, showing him where he falls short. It seems as though Mengzi first flatters the king to get him on side, before taking a firm stance on how he could do much better. Certainly, this would be the sort of shrewd strategy called for when speaking truth to power, but there is more to this than tactics. In Mengzi's view, it is important to affirm that everybody has the ability to live a morally good life. He claims that the sage and we are the same in kind. We are the same because we each have in us a heart-mind that endorses moral principles and rightness. This resounding affirmation of a capacity for goodness in each person was not merely a feel-good statement. It gave voice, a moral voice, to individuals during a time when the world was a grossly unequal place and when people could not always even meet their basic needs, such as security, stability, health, and food. To maintain its optimism in the life that we could have, the Mengzi, of course, needs to explain what has gone wrong. Here is King Xuan, desiring to learn from Mengzi, a good start. His leadership, though, is well below exemplary. Being focused on occupying more territory and conquests, he neglects his people. Mengzi tells the king that his pursuits are misdirected. A true king would rule territories by winning the people's hearts. Mengzi spares no words in chastising his ambition for conquest, saying, "To pursue such a desire by acting in the way you do is like climbing a tree in search of a fish." The king takes this with surprisingly good cheer, which might seem unrealistic, but could function as a lesson to powerful readers in how they themselves should react to frank and fearless advice. So, how can King Xuan get his act together to save his reign and protect his people? Well, he has a heart-mind that cannot bear the suffering of others, says Mengzi. But then, so does everyone. Just like the English word heart, which may be used to refer both to the organ and the seat of our emotions and affection, the Chinese term xin is also used in both these ways. However, xin in Chinese philosophy has a broader focus than the emotions. It may refer to the intellect, as in the case of someone's seeing things in a certain way, or it may refer to both the intellect and emotions together, as when Mengzi's words are said to be kept in one's heart-mind. So we follow other scholars in using the phrase heart-mind for xin to reflect these dimensions. It was particularly important for the Warring States Confucians, as xin is, among other things, the human capacity for morality. This means that they understood morality to be associated with emotions or with intellect, and sometimes with both. Mengzi articulated 4 aspects of the heart-mind, which help us to establish a more robust account of morality. These 4 are benevolence, rightness, propriety, and wisdom. We talked about this list of so-called Confucian cardinal virtues in the last episode. To recap, benevolence, or ren, refers to a fundamental fellow feeling that should underlie human pursuits. Rightness, yi, focuses on doing the right thing, on what is morally appropriate in different situations. Propriety, li, is incorporated into practices that recognize a person's standing in relation to others, for example as a son to a father. Wisdom, zi, relates to an appreciation of how matters stand in light of others. It often involves insight into the relative priority of things. Though we discussed these with some hesitancy as virtues before, it might be better just to think of them in terms of capacities. They are capacities that grow from 4 sprouts, a botanical metaphor that is prominent in the Mengzi. Like the tender sprout of a plant, feelings of tender benevolence need to be nurtured and carefully encouraged so that they may bloom into full maturity and strength. Mengzi uses a complex phrase to describe each of the sprouts. Here we used paired words to describe each sprout to give a sense of its scope. Of these sprouts of the heart-mind, sympathy-compassion is the sprout of benevolence, aversion-repugnance is the sprout of rightness, modesty-deference is the sprout of propriety, approval-denial is the sprout of wisdom. The Mengzi does not tell us much about what these sprouts are, apart from stating that they are the basic aspects of the heart-mind. The sprouts could be innate capacities or dispositions, especially as the Mengzi also says, human beings have these 4 sprouts just as they have 4 limbs. This suggests that we are born with the sprouts, that these capacities or dispositions are innate in humanity. If they are taken as a natural, powerful, and universal inclination of humans towards goodness, Mengzi's view may indeed seem overly optimistic, given that acts of evil and violence are very much a part of human experience. On the other hand, the sprouts need to be robust enough to give humans a basis for successful moral development. So it's natural that scholarly debates about the Mengzi have often centered on the questions of the roles of the sprouts, how they interact, and how they are cultivated to grow into the virtues of benevolence, rightness, propriety, and wisdom. Now let's go back to the conversation between Mengzi and King Xuan, which gives us a concrete illustration of the king's compassionate heart-mind. One of the king's attendants has noted to Mengzi that on one occasion, when an ox was being led to slaughter as part of a sacrificial ritual, the king ordered that the ox be spared its life. He was reported to have said, "I cannot bear its trembling like one who, though blameless, is being led to the execution ground." The king ordered that a sheep be substituted for the ox. After getting confirmation that this did indeed happen, Mengzi observes that the episode is proof that the king has the potential to become a true king. Why then is he not a true king? Why does King Xuan let his people suffer? Mengzi notes bluntly that the king's lapse is not due to a lack of ability, neng, but a failure to act, wei. There are 3 things the king must do in order to take action as a true king. First, the king's kindness, which already reaches animals, must be extended to his people. Mengzi instructs the king with examples of what it means to extend one's kindness, tui en. He says, by treating the elders in one's own family as elders should be treated, and extending this to the elders of other families, and by treating the young of one's own family as the young ought to be treated, and extending this to the young of other people's families. It seems that this extension process simply means that the king should broaden the scope of the recipients of his kind acts, from oxen to people, and maybe while he's at it, he could consider the plight of the poor sheep. But again, there may be more to it. Extension does not merely mean that the king should be compassionate to a larger number of beings. It's crucial that the king develop his compassionate heart-mind in the process of extension. In other words, the relevant sense of extension is that by extending kindness to the people, the king is at the same time developing his heart-mind. In doing so, his sympathy-compassion sprout of his heart-mind is increasingly oriented towards benevolence. The second thing the king needs to do is get his priorities right. Mengzi uses metaphors of weighing heavy and light, and of measuring long and short, to taunt the king. Knowing exactly where the king's priorities lie, Mengzi says, when the king raises arms, endangers his subjects, and excites the enmity of the other feudal lords, does this perhaps bring pleasure to his heart-mind? This passage shows that the heart-mind is given to feeling less attractive emotions too. We are given to ambition and lust for dominance, just as much as we are given to benevolence. Third, the king needs to place himself in environments which are conducive to developing his heart-mind. Ideally, he needs to expose himself to his people's suffering, but failing that, Mengzi can instead present him with a vivid description of their desperation. Not being able to provide either for their parents or children, all they can do is attempt to avoid death. How could they even turn their thoughts to propriety and rightness? In this conversation, Mengzi is not just an advisor offering pragmatic advice, but appeals to the king's moral sensibility. As the king's compassion was roused when he witnessed the trembling ox being led to a sacrificial death, Mengzi now attempts to stir the king's compassion for his suffering people. In a small, seemingly throwaway comment, which has puzzled scholars, Mengzi tells the king he is to avoid going into the kitchen. Mengzi says, "This is the way of the noble person in regard to animals. If he sees them alive, then he cannot bear to see them die, and if he hears their cries, then he cannot bear to eat their flesh. And so the noble person stays far away from the kitchen." There's a simple explanation of Mengzi's advice to the king. Because what moves us is the suffering of others, King Xuan's role as a true king, in order to set his priorities right, should not involve visits to the kitchen. Not because it will upset him, but because this is the wrong thing for him to be upset about. The suffering of oxen is not the plight that should concern him as a king. Rather, he should be taking inspection tours of his state, as kings were expected to do, in order properly to understand the living conditions of his people. The situation for the people is dire, and his focus on his people's suffering is critical now. From Mengzi's point of view, the king's experience of his people's suffering should provoke his compassionate heart-mind. Prior to his inspection tours, Mengzi is keen to tell him what their situation is. If the king were to witness their suffering, the encounter would also help align his priorities with those of a true king. Though it may seem that Mengzi is appealing to the king's emotions, his intellect should also be engaged. If the heart-mind is naturally responsive in the way Mengzi says it is, then it is vital that we expose ourselves to the suffering that will provoke true benevolence. Mengzi paints a picture of the people suffering for the king, but this does not mean that we need always highlight the suffering of others as a general principle in order to arouse or engage the heart-mind. In other words, it's not that the greater the exposure to other suffering, the more compassionate one's heart-mind becomes. Rather, Mengzi tells the king how his people are suffering because the king must have an accurate understanding of what is going on in his state. The different capacities of the heart-mind, his senses of rightness and propriety, and his wisdom and compassion should work in an integrated way. Bangre Suk, a scholar of Mencian philosophy, points out that one's not being able to bear another's suffering is an integrative and holistic experience, and in addition that the perception of another's potential suffering becomes physically vivid, emotionally loaded, and motivationally primed. Even as seeing the trembling ox prompts him to take action to relieve its suffering, encountering his people's suffering should likewise spur him on to take morally appropriate action. The point about exposure is a more general issue for Mengzi. Not just kings, but everyone, and especially children, must be nurtured in the most caring and compassionate ways. Mengzi recognizes the importance of our moral environments. He says that, in flourishing years, the young rely on conditions conducive to life and are amicable. In difficult years, the young are aggressive. This is not due to differences in their heavenly endowed abilities, but to what drowns their heart minds. Mengzi is right about how our experiences are important, especially in the formative years of our lives. Consider the scars of traumatic childhood experiences that are continued into later life, or the many thousands of children whose sense of security and stability is upended by displacement, poverty, and war. And consider, conversely, how positive childhood experiences can contribute to setting up a person for life. Mengzi gives central place to the influences on our heart-mind, emphasizing that it needs to be nourished, yang. In his view, as humans, we do not begin life with a tabula rasa, a clean slate without any sense of moral direction. He asks emphatically, could it be that anyone should lack the heart-mind of benevolence and rightness? To this question, Mengzi would respond, yes and no. One could lose the moral heart-mind even though every person is born with it. He illustrates this point with the image of trees on a mountain. The trees on Ox Mountain have been hewn, rendering the mountain barren as if it had never been wooded. The image of the hewn trees is analogized to the heart-mind that has been lost. Although the heart-mind is distinctively human and belongs to all humans from birth, it is possible to have it and then to lose it. This would make it seem as if one never had it in the first place. Therefore, it is critical that the heart-mind's sprouts be appropriately nourished so that it may grow and manifest benevolence, rightness, propriety, and wisdom. There are two fundamental themes in the Mengzi's views on nurturing human goodness. First, humans, uniquely and innately, have a propensity for goodness. But secondly, simply to possess this propensity does not guarantee a moral life. The heart-mind is said to be endowed by heaven, but it must be nurtured. The process of nurturing brings together these two aspects of the heart-mind. As a capacity for goodness, it is what humans are born with, but it is unfinished and needs to be grown in the right ways so that it flourishes. We can better understand this dual aspect of the heart-mind by alluding to Mengzi's analogy between our heart-mind and our four limbs. We are born with our limbs, but if we do not use them, we lose them, so to speak. Those of us who have suffered from a fracture or broken bone will realize how quickly we lose muscle control when we are not able to move around as we normally do. And those of us who are dexterous or who appreciate the agility of athletes understand even more acutely how, if not properly nurtured, our capacities and skills can be lost. As we've already noted, though, the way the Mengzi talks about the sprouts and how they develop into the four capacities of the heart-mind is not particularly clear. What are the sprouts, after all? Are they capacities that need to be honed, or are they aspects of moral goodness that we already have in us, which will be activated as long as nothing else gets in the way? This lack of clarity might be due to what we've just now considered, that Mengzi seems to speak about the goodness of the heart-mind in two ways. First, all humans have this capacity, and second, having it is barely sufficient for us to be a moral person. We see this too with the use of the word xing, referring to the nature of humans. The Mengzi says xing shan, meaning xing is good. The term xing is frequently translated human nature, so Mengzi is understood here to say human nature is good. This translation makes Mengzi's remark sound naive and implausible. In fact, the word xing is made up of two components, the first of which is xing, the heart-mind, and the second, sheng, which can mean either birth or growth. The sinologist Angus Graham suggests that Mengzi's phrase, xing is good, could encompass the dual meanings of birth and growth. That is, for Mengzi, the inborn tendency of the heart-mind, when properly nurtured, manifests goodness. The heart-mind's goodness is not static, settled once and for all. It is vital and active and can be debased or nurtured. Mengzi's phrase, xing is good, tells us both about the character of our heart-mind and the direction in which it should be nurtured. We could say the same of the sprouts. We should focus not on what they are, but on their condition of sprouting. Only when cultivated properly will they grow into the four capacities of the heart-mind. When we understand Mengzi's views in this way, they turn out to be not so simplistic after all. Let us return finally to the thought experiment of the child about to fall into the well. We are distressed, Mengzi says, not because we seek the favor of the child's parents, or to be praised for a heroic rescue, or to avoid the poor reputation that would result from failing to respond appropriately. Mengzi discounts such external reasons for our alarm, leaving us only with the possibility that the feeling arises from within us, so to speak. Mengzi thinks that we will agree simply by introspecting, by imagining, as we asked you to do at the start of this episode, how one would feel in that situation. The thought experiment draws our attention to our natural tendency for benevolence, allowing us to confirm for ourselves that human nature is as Mengzi suggests. It's also important to clarify the response that he expects us to have. All he says is that we will be unable to bear the sight of a child coming to harm. Some scholars take Mengzi's views an unwarranted step further to suggest that in the thought experiment, the claim is that any bystander who witnesses such an event will take steps to save the child from falling into the well. This would be a more difficult thesis to maintain, and this interpretation of the passage in fact sets Mengzi up to fail, because it would be too unsophisticated to suggest that the sight of another coming to harm necessarily produces the right kinds of actions in us. Mengzi never at any point makes this claim, which again shows him to be a much subtler thinker than some take him to be. During a difficult time in China's history, Mengzi optimistically affirmed that we have these stirrings of goodness in us. He's not merely telling us what human nature is like. The careful attention to what we may draw upon as beings with a unique sense of togetherness and compassion is compelling. Mengzi's philosophy is also a call to action. When he says that our four sprouts are like a fire beginning to burn or a spring finding an outlet, he charts a path for us responsibly to think about how we nurture the young. It's no wonder that the impact of Mengzi's philosophy is often considered as having surpassed that of Kongzi, which is not to say that everyone, or even every Confucian, would agree. Soon we'll move on to the third great figure of the classical Confucian tradition, Shunzi, often considered to be the cynical complement of Mengzi's optimistic outlook. But first we're going to consider another thinker of this period who at first glance seems more cynical still. Notorious for his hedonism and self-interest, Yang Tzu was named by Mengzi himself as a serious threat to the morals of the time. Was he really so bad? It will be our pleasure to tell you next time here on The History of Philosophy in China.